each of you, and welcome to another episode of Heart-Centered Marriage. For those of you who are new to my channel, hi, I am the Reverend Dr. Shalita Mira. I am the owner and clinical director of the Heart-Centered Journey Counseling, Coaching, and Consultation, and I am also a senior pastor. This channel focuses on building healthy and resilient marriages. We know that marriage is one of the unions that most exemplifies Christ's relationship to the body of Christ and to the church. And so we spend time on this channel preparing, cultivating, and growing in the space of marriage. So last week we looked at 9 attributes of a healthy marriage. And today we are going to take those 9 attributes and one by one, we're going to hyper focus in on those attributes so that we can learn how they manifest in our marriages. And so today we get to focus on our first attribute, which was calm communication. We are going to dissect calm communication so that after you watch this video, you know how to communicate calmly in your marriages. So before we dive into exploring calm communication, I'm going to ask that you help me build strong and resilient marriages. How will you do that, you may be asking? Simply click the like, share button and subscribe to my YouTube channel. By doing those simple steps, you can help me reach marriages all around the world so that we can all grow together as we emulate the commitment and the covenant and the faithfulness of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. We know that one of the most important communication skills to create and preserve intimacy is listening. When you listen well, when you intend to understand your partner, when you stay closely attuned to not only what they're saying with their mouth, but also what they're saying with their heart, it allows us to create a space of communion, and then our response is that of love. And so today, as we explore calm communication, what we're going to be talking about specifically is the art of listening. I say the art of listening because listening really is an art. And listening requires not just our ears, but it requires our sight. It requires our mind or our thought process. It also requires our heart. In order for us to be able to see, absorb, critically analyze, and to feel the emotion that is being exchanged in the process of communication, that means that we must listen actively. So we are going to explore 4 attributes in the art of listening. The first thing we have to do whenever we are going to engage in dialogue or communication with our spouses is to listen with intention. Real listening is distinguished by your intention. When you show up in the context of the communication, our spouses can often tell whether we want to be in the space to hear what they have to communicate or whether we are disinterested in what it is that they have to say. So we must set an intention to practice loving and respectful presence and loving and respectful dialogue that seeks to understand, that seeks to learn, that seeks to develop and to grow in intimacy. So before any words are exchanged, before any nonverbal communication is exchanged, the first thing that we must do is be present on purpose in the dialogue with our spouse. When we show up with intention, we can then engage in active listening. The second thing that we want to do is we want to practice what's called reciprocal dialogue. When we're engaging in conversation, if we're not careful, we will find ourselves engaging in interrupters. We will find ourselves giving premature advice. We will find ourselves interrupting and cutting off the flow of the expression, whether it's verbal or whether it's an expression of feeling that our spouse may be trying to articulate in that moment. So when we take turns being the speaker and the listener, it allows a safe space for the fullness, the expressional fullness of what needs to be communicated. And so this allows both parties to take turns engaging in the speaking and the listening roles without interruption. If you have a problem sitting and listening to your spouse for maybe a longer period of time and you are afraid you're going to forget what it is you wanted to say, take a pen and a pad, and as your partner is speaking, just jot down some shorthand notes. Make sure to let them know before you start this conversation that you're going to take some notes so that you have less probability of interrupting them as they are communicating. So when you take those shorthand notes, when it's your time to speak, then you can then come back and bring up some pertinent or important points that you then want to communicate back to your partner. So we want to practice reciprocal dialogue because it gives each partner the opportunity to both speak and to listen. The third tip that we're going to explore is called listening actively. We talked about it a little bit as we started the intro to this series, but it's important to understand again, and I reiterate, that when we listen, we're using more than our ears. Listening actively begins with a desire to be present in the moment, a desire to engage in this exchange, right? We talked about that a little bit when we talked about listening with intention. But that means I'm watching your nonverbals. It means as you're speaking, I am absorbing the fullness of what you have to say. I'm not thinking about what I'm going to cook for dinner. I'm not thinking about what the kids are doing. I'm not thinking about my job. I am fully focused and attuned to what you're having to say in this moment. I'm also listening with my heart. I'm paying attention to your tonal inflections. Paying attention to the passion in your voice. I'm paying attention to the tear, or maybe the expression of sadness or anger or frustration. And when I communicate back to you, I'm communicating from a space of empathy, not a space of judgment, not a space of criticism, not a space of frustration or irritability. I'm communicating back to you from a space of love, of unconditional love. We often find that for spouses, as they're engaging in this dialogue, they seem to get frustrated with one another. And that frustration shows up when they respond. So what I want you to do is practice just listening actively, paying attention to the fullness of the experience that your partner is sitting in the moment that they are talking to you. And when you respond empathically, respond respectfully, and respond in love. And the fourth tip that I want to leave with you today is to identify your blocks to listening. We all have blocks to listening, which leads to what is known as pseudo-listening. Pseudo-listening is aggressive and it is not focused, it is not attentive, it is not being present in the moment, it's not listening to understand, it is just occupying a space looking for the first opportunity to offer an opinion or a solution so that you can go do whatever else it is you want to do. Pseudo listening jumps very quickly to problem solving, but there are times in the exchange of dialogue that I'm not looking for a solution. I'm looking for a space to affectively vent, to just share what I'm feeling, to release the burden. I'm looking for a shoulder to lean on. I'm looking for a safe space to express how I feel, because there may be no other environment around me that allows me the space and the time and the focused attention to share how I feel. And so in this space with your spouse, what you want to do is be careful about listening blocks. Be careful about pseudo listening, because pseudo listening will be an impairment to your ability to hear actively. It'll be an impairment to your ability to understand. And it will be an impairment to your ability to respond to your partner. And so you may be saying, well, Dr. Mira, how do I know what my listening blocks are? Well, I'm glad you asked, because what we're going to do now is we're going to explore 11 listening blocks so that you will know which tactics or strategies kind of show up in the normal course of your dialogue with your spouse, so that you can grow in your ability to create calm spaces of communication. Listening blocks. So I want you to make sure that you spend some time really hearing what I have to say here as we talk about listening blocks, because listening blocks are the barriers to calm communication, and the utilization of these different blocks actually lead to more conflictual communication. So block number 1 is going to be mind reading. Many of us have been married to our spouses for many, many years. And so when we sit down to have this dialogue, oftentimes we think that we automatically know what our spouse is thinking and what they're feeling. And so the mind reading shows up as finishing our spouse's sentences or giving them certain facial expressions as they're sharing how they feel about particular situations. It may even be in our posture. Maybe we feel like we've heard this over and over again. I've already given you the solution and answer to this. Here we go again, right? But maybe, just maybe this time, what your spouse has to say is different. Maybe, just maybe, they have spent some time in prayer. Maybe they've spent some time critically analyzing the scenario, and they want to present to you a different paradigm, a different process of thought. Mind reading comes in to stop the flow of communication because we are forthtelling, or we are showing up in a space where we think we already know the context of what's going to be said, and we already know the answer. So I'm going to encourage you that if you practice mind reading, stop. It halts the flow of communication. It halts the flow of intimacy. No mind reading. Rehearsing is our second block. So we know when we show up in the context of conversations and we're listening to what our partner is saying, in our mind, we are rehearsing what our response is going to be. But I want you to know that as you're rehearsing what your response is going to be, oftentimes it stops you from being present in the moment, and it is a barrier to your ability to actively listen. Because you're processing in your mind what your response is going to be. A part of that communicative piece of you is it's halted. It cannot absorb and receive what your spouse is saying while at the same time process your response. And so what that means is we need to stop showing up in communication with our spouse to simply respond. We want to receive. We want to understand. We want to critically analyze. We want to feel the fullness of their emotion. And after we've done all of that, then we want to craft an authentic and empathic response. But we cannot engage in rehearsing and active listening at the same time. Block number 3 is filtering. So filtering has to do with selective listening. Oftentimes, again, when we're engaging in dialogue with our spouses, we think we've heard this already. We've heard it over and over and over again, so we pick and choose what we listen to. It's kind of the one ear and out the other concept, meaning that I'm only picking and choosing to hear and think about or process the pieces that I think are important instead of listening to the fullness of what my spouse has to say. So we're intentionally grabbing hold to certain pieces and excluding others. Filtering often happens when we're in conflictual or contentious conversations. Maybe there is a debate, or maybe we've had an argument about something that's significant. And so in the moment when we're having a conversation about it, I only hear what I want to hear. I'm skipping over words or inserting in between the lines that to which I want to hear. Maybe I am hyper-focusing on sadness, or I'm hyper-focusing on your anger, or I'm hyper-focusing on some emotion without hearing the fullness of what you're saying. That's filtering. And filtering is miscommunication because it's an intentional selection of what you hear, and it's also an intentional selection of what you don't want to hear. We don't want to filter. We want to hear the fullness of what our spouse has to say. All right, block number 4 is judging. We do this, and sometimes we don't even realize that we are doing it. We're judging. Because we know our spouse is best, or we hope that we know our spouse is best in the context of maybe newer marriages. There are times when we're engaging in heated dialogue. We are maybe not on the same page about a parenting strategy or finances or some other issue or topic of discussion. And if we're not careful, what will happen is we will begin to judge our partner. We'll judge their response. We'll judge their behavior. We'll judge their feelings. We'll judge how they're responding in the conversation, right? Judging is really focused on negative labeling. It's focused on blaming. It's focused on filtering through the conversation to find some evidence to support my side or my perception. So if we're not careful and intentional about eliminating the judgment from our conversations with our spouses, what will happen is we won't be able to accomplish anything. Instead of communication, we will argue. And in arguments, there's no communication because it's two people trying to talk at the same time and no one listening. Be careful that when you're communicating back to your spouse, you're communicating from a space of empathy and love and respect, and not from a place of blame and ridicule and judgment and negative labeling. Judgment is the death of conversation. So we want to practice creating safe spaces for the fullness of emotional expression. All right, block number 5 is daydreaming. Oh, we do this often. And if we're not careful to ensure that we are actively present in the moment, mindfully present in the moment, what'll happen is our minds will wander off. And when our minds wander off, there are periods of time where we do not hear what our spouse is saying, or we may be missing important nonverbal pieces of the communication. So I want you to make sure, again, that as you're entering into conversations, when you're listening to your spouse, don't daydream, and please don't doze off. Be present in the moment. Be actively attuned to what your spouse is saying, so that when you respond, you want to respond to what they have stated or communicated, and not respond to missed pieces that did not exist in the conversation. So block 6 is actually one of my pet peeves, and it is interruption and advising. Now, of course, when we're communicating with our spouses, we want their advice. We want their opinions. We trust their advice and their opinions. But oftentimes, if we're not careful, when we're listening, again, we will automatically jump in and we will interrupt our spouse in order to offer our advice. And sure, our advice may be awesome. It may be phenomenal. But what happens when you interrupt is you're communicating to the one spouse that what they have to say is not important, and that what you have to interject at that moment is of the utmost importance. Again, remember, in communication, a part of it is what is being said, but the other part of it is just having the space to express, to vent, to lay the burden down at the feet of the Lord, or to have someone help us carry our burdens. So when we interrupt, we stop the flow of expression. We want that expression to flow, so that when we do get to the space of advising, our spouses have had a place of divine and intimate release. So be careful about interruptions and save your advising to the space when it's your turn to communicate or your turn to speak. All right, we're almost finished. We're at block number 7, and this block is called sparring. And sparring happens when we're in heightened or intense conversations or even dialogue. At the point of sparring, we're moving into the argumentative space. Listening only exists for the sake of finding something else in the context of the conversation to fight about or to argue about, to fault find, to demean, or to debate. Sparring is kind of like the tit for tat. It's the going back and forth. When you're at the place of sparring, no communication is happening. It is best when we find ourselves sparring to just stop the communication in that moment and to set another time when we can engage in healthy dialogue, because sparring only adds fuel to the fire, and it adds another layer, something else for us to engage in heated debate about. No sparring in our marriages. Block number 8 is being right. I know I'm guilty of this, right? We all want to be right. We all love those I told you so moments. But if we're not careful, our attempt to be right or to have those I told you so moments may close the door to deep levels of intimacy that can actually help us to grow closer and more intimate in our marriages. Remember, in marriages, it's not about being right or being wrong. It's about being respectful. It's about being loving. It's about being safe. It is about being able to talk about anything, even the hard things, with the expectation of receiving grace, mercy, and unconditional love. I want you to remember that being right is the last thing that you want to seek to accomplish when you are engaging in dialogue with your spouse. I want you to prioritize being loved and being respectful when you're engaging in conversations with your spouse. Block 9 is deflecting or derailing. We all have our feelings about sarcasm. I always say sarcasm always has a bit of truth into it. But oftentimes sarcasm is used to kind of deflect or derail the conversation. There are times, we have to be honest, that we may not have the capacity in that moment to engage in intense conversations with our spouse. It's incumbent upon us to just share that with our spouses, right? Babe, I love you, but I've had an emotionally draining day. I want to hear you. I want to be here for you. Can we set this up to talk about later? If we don't openly communicate our capacity deficits in that moment, what happens is we subconsciously engage in deflecting or derailing, meaning that we're trying to hurry the conversation along because we really are not in this moment willing, able, or desiring to engage in this conversation with our spouse. And so have those candid and open and honest conversations with your spouse. If it's a good time and you have the capacity to be present, by all means do so. But if not, lovingly express to your spouse that in this moment might not be the best time to talk about whatever the context of the conversation is, but set a date so that your spouse knows that you're not trying to deflect or derail. You do want to be present wholly for them, but you want to do it in a space where you can be wholly present and have the capacity to engage in active listening. Blocks 10 and 11 I'm going to do together because they are actually two sides of the same coin. Block 11 is called placating and block 12 is dismissing. Placating is this passive form of communication where we just quickly agree with our partner. We haven't really heard the fullness of what they have to say or express. We haven't even really given them the space to fully share what they're thinking, what they're feeling, how they're processing. We just immediately jump in and we agree, we lend our support in order to get the conversation over with, right? Placating is concerned with being nice and being super supportive, right? And being agreeable instead of being honest. What we need to understand is when our spouses are engaging in dialogue with us, sometimes our honest response may not always be in agreement. Now, we can be in a state where we don't agree, but that doesn't mean we need to be disagreeable. It's okay to agree that we may disagree on this particular topic or approach. The goal is to compromise. That's where compromise comes in. Compromise always exists when maybe we have two different perceptions. But because we love each other and we respect each other, we can create a solution that allows both of our thoughts and feelings to be honored. So don't placate, right? But also don't be dismissive. So many of us, as our spouses are trying to engage in dialogue, we simply don't want to hear it. We want what we want. What we say goes. There's no space for compromise. And it's what I say or nothing else, right? We don't want to be dismissive. We want to sit down at the table. Let's talk about all of the possible scenarios and solutions. Let's talk about how you see this and how you feel about this. And then at the end of all of that, let's develop a solution that honors each other, that honors our marriage, that honors God, that honors our family, that honors our present and honors our future. We want to make sure that when we're showing up in conversation with our spouses, we're not placating and we're not dismissing. All right, that concludes this section's overview of attribute number 1, calm communication through the art of active listening. I want you to really prayerfully contemplate the 4 healthy strategies to effective, healthy communication, effective, healthy listening, and also examine yourself to see which of the 11 blocks that you might be utilizing when you communicate with your spouse. And for the first 100 subscribers, I am going to send to you my workbook, which will be pinned up here. The workbook actually has all of the strategies that we have covered in today's little mini lesson, in addition to a listening blocks checklist and a space for you to create an intention on how you can create calm communication with your spouse moving forward. So if you want access to this free resource, I need you to like, share, and subscribe. And in the comments below, I need you to type in there, I have subscribed, send me the resource. And our team will ensure that you have access to this free workbook to help you in the art of listening as you create spaces for clear communication. It is my prayer that this video today helps you to grow as we continue to reflect Christ in our marriages. It is my prayer that every tip and strategy shared helps you to glow on your heart-centered journey. I hope that you will be back with me next week for our next video that focuses on the next attribute in our communication series, our healthy communication series. May God bless you and keep you and your families is my prayer, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Bye-bye.